Alrighty, so we're a couple minutes early. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a moment. Alrighty, so welcome back, PM Peeps, to PM Corner. Now, as you see on the screen, we're going to do a little bit of a different thing today. It seems as though we've just been consistently project after project after project. And I thought, this stream, instead of focusing on another project, let's just take a moment and actually cover the concepts in a very simplified manner. And why do I say that? Because you know what I'm talking about to some degree, but really, when it comes down to it, you probably are still wondering, like, what do some of these concepts mean? Like, okay, I understand how she's applying it, but I still don't understand how this works. So that's what we're going to go over today. So, before we begin, though, if you like what you see on this channel and the streams and YouTube and even TikTok, please give me a follow and subscribe on Twitch, Twitter, TikTok, Patreon, or YouTube. If you're also interested in supporting the content, please feel free to donate at the PayPal link that's provided in my link tree, or you can also subscribe to my Patreon where you get more benefits and perks such as my slides, my scripts for my streams, and also, you get to know about the topics a little more in advance, and you get free stuff as well. So, keep that in mind, PM peeps. So, of course, what I want to do tonight is do a summary of project management concepts. Because, again, it's great and all that I talk about them somewhat in, the streams, but sometimes it's just one or two, maybe three if we're lucky. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to just go over these concepts, go over these different management processes, better understand what's going on. And for those of you that maybe are preparing for the PMP exam, this might be a good introductory, stream to kind of get you more familiar with it so that when you go and read the PMBOK, although I'm going to tell you right now, that's like reading Hawthorne, you're going to have to figure out what it really is. And this will help solidify and simplify it a little bit so that way you're not totally muddling through the mud trying to figure out what these concepts are. So before we begin, I always teach my students this. There are 7 key items to project management that are always referred to throughout the PMBOK, any prep book, and you will constantly see them throughout all the other chapters if you're reading the PMBOK or exam prep book. So first things first is we need business value. Now, what is business value? Business value is what is being in more modern terms, brought to the table. What are you getting out of this? What is the point of this? And it's very important to understand business value because that feeds into our project charter. Now, the project charter and the project management plan we'll talk about more when we talk about integration management and especially when we talk about initiating phase and the planning phase. But basically, the project charter is the why are we doing this project in the first place? Hence why you need to understand the business value and say, okay, so what's the point of this project? And then when you get to the charter, you now are going, why are we doing this project? Then, of course, you have the project management plan, as I was mentioning earlier. This is essentially your roadmap of how you're going to approach your project from beginning to end. Now, that doesn't always necessarily mean that it's every single little detail down to the nines for some projects, right? So, for example, agile fundamentalists like to complain about how project management always tries to have everything detailed out and so forth, which in reality is not completely true. It just depends, on people. And that's what I will always emphasize is that people are the ones that get in their own way. And you see that even in personal life when someone, wants to make an improvement of some thing in their life. What do most people tend to do? They tend to make excuses, get in their own way, basically. Same thing can happen for any type of, implementation process, you name it. So what the project management plan does is, say if you're in a more software development environment, you can do a thing called progressive elaboration, even if you're not doing agile. You can do a thing called progressive elaboration where you kind of chunk out, maybe not as small as 2 weeks like Scrum would, but you can chunk out small chunks of time and detail that out and leave everything in the future kind of vague. But your processes should not be vague at all whatsoever. Now, does that mean you can't make changes to them if you start to implement them and you're like, "Oh, you know what? That's actually really inefficient." No, it doesn't mean you're not allowed to. But you have to understand the impacts that it has, right? Which then we'll talk about more when we get to integrated change control, which is the seventh item. And by the way, these don't have a particular order and ranking. I just listed them as the 7 items. Then, of course, another piece of this is the enterprise environmental factors, the EEFs. Now, the PMBOK tends to break the EEFs down into two types. You have an external EEF, which is more about government regulations, local, state. Those are the most common ones we tend to think of, right? Or like EPA, OSHA. Those have an effect. And then internal EEFs are all about your company's organization, structure, maybe even geographic locations. Now, you're probably wondering, well, okay, that's great and all, but what's the point of an EEF? Well, an EEF is something you, as a project manager, cannot control. And you have to take this into consideration because some of that can, in fact, be a hindrance to you, a constraint. We talk about constraints a lot when it comes to planning, when it comes to the initiating phase, particularly, is that when you have constraints, you got to kind of live within them, right? So, say for example, Starbucks wants to open another store. Well, they have to take in consideration county ordinances, for example. What are the taxes for particular counties? What would be more beneficial? What are some federal regulations they'll have to take in consideration when it comes to hiring employees? What about state regulations? OSHA, as another example. And so that's something as a project manager you too have to take in consideration is what is going to impact my project that I have no control over. Our next item too is then organizational process assets, or also known as OPAs. Now, OPAs are basically your knowledge repositories, but they're also a place where you hold your overall organization's policies, processes, and procedures. Now, of course, that means you have some form of governance. Now, when we talk about governance, think of your employee handbook at any company or organization you've ever worked for. And your employee handbook, what does it do? It lays out processes for how to request vacation, how to deal with sick leave, how to dress, even. So, for some industries, like retail, maybe even restaurant, depending on the restaurant, right? They would have requirements in terms of what you can and can't wear, how you would present yourself, and so forth. As an example of that, um, I remember when I once upon a time worked for Starbucks. We had a policy for a very long time. This is long before, baristas were allowed to wear whatever they really wanted as long as it was work appropriate, right? We had to wear a standard uniform of black pants and either a black collared shirt or a white collared shirt, or a khaki pants with a black collared shirt or a white collared shirt. And that was the standard dress code for a very, very long time. And then and I can't remember what year that they changed that policy. It must have been like right before I left. Um, but basically, they changed it to where people could wear certain types of clothes that were kind of like regular clothes. And that, again, that was a change in policy. Now, of course, as I had diverged a little bit, OPAs also include your historic knowledge. What do we mean by historic knowledge? Well, when you have organizations that have multiple projects, programs, portfolios, you want to be able to go back in time and understand, like, well, what did this project do? What did that program do? How did they do this? How did they do that? Did they have a similar client like we do? Or is it the exact same client? And if so, were they, compliant? Were they not? And that's where you're going to find that information is in the historic knowledge repositories of OPAs, and they serve a huge purpose, which also leads into one of those things that goes into an OPA is lessons learned. If you remember from my past now 2 streams where I talked about first and foremost the Apollo space program, and then I talked about AS 201 through 203, and also the unfortunate tragedy of Apollo 1, also known as AS 204, we talked about lessons learned. And lessons learned is essential because it collects, and this is in the PMBOK as well, is explicit and tacit knowledge. Now, of course, you can categorize that explicit and tacit knowledge through, is it technical? Is it business? Is it this? Is it that? Whatever the category you want it to be. But at the end of the day, you are documenting what you learn as you go through the project. And, sometimes you just need to have you may have resolution for it, sometimes you may not. Sometimes you got to think about things a little bit more and be like, well, how can we better improve that? And that's not something that's always going to be solved, like that, in the middle of the night, done, magic fairy comes through and makes that all happen. But it's very helpful, and it's just documentation because, again, future projects are going to look at your project and go, what did they do different? And then the final, but also very important piece is integrated change control. Now, agile fundamentalists like to talk about how, oh, well, we don't have to worry about integrated change control because we just make changes as we go. Okay, yes, but you still have a level of change control because you're going through the product owner by saying, okay, so is this still the priorities? And the product owner is giving you direction on what the new priorities are or what is the change instead of you just going through a CCB board. And of course, in Agile, the concept is to fail fast and early instead of later. So, of course, in the beginning, when you have a product owner that's still trying to figure out what they want still, so you give them what you can, it helps for them to be able to make the shift and change in direction, but that is still a form of change. And you are notating that in your retrospectives, by the way, which is again a form of lessons learned. It's just people don't really put two and two together. Now, of course, in project management, when you're not really doing agile as your, how do you say, technique in approaching the work, in integrated change control, you do have things called change control boards or CCB boards. Now, this is more common in the government. I've not really seen this more with private sector, which would be like your Verizons and all that. However, there are a lot of change control boards because they want to make sure that the changes you are making, you understand what the impacts are, and so that they understand what the impacts are. And as part of change control, you go through the process of saying, okay, well, what are the changes I am making to this particular item? It could be your scope, which is huge, your schedule or cost, or it can be something minor like, okay, we think it's minor, but why are we making a change to it? And what that does is it documents changes so that when you update your project management plan, again, your roadmap of how you're going to do things from beginning to end, you're performing to the most current project management plan. And so many times people will make changes to their baseline and then not perform to it in the real world, which is very unfortunate. But that's also why change control boards are very necessary. If you also have a very heavily earned value type program, and I'm talking real earned value, not just the light stuff that lots of contracts like to do, you will do things like BCRs or baseline change requests so that you are documenting what was originally agreed to and what was the change and how was that an impact. Or if it didn't make an impact, you still have to make sure that you're documenting the change. That can also include making adjustments to hours to update your ETCs or your estimate to completion. Before I continue on, does anyone have any questions about the 7 key items we just covered? Okay, So we're going to move on and we're going to now talk about the phases of a project. Now, if you've already started your PMP training and journey, great. This is a refresher for you. If not, not a big deal. So, in project management, we have phases called initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. These are essential, and the PMBOK breaks it down to make it like it's its own entity. But in reality, we do this all the time. We're always kind of shifting through these phases very naturally. But the problem is that when people start to study the PMP, not only are they doing like a massive brain dump of their own experience and knowledge from being PMs, they also have to learn how the PMBOK likes it. And the PMBOK, like I said, it's like reading Hawthorne, but it's also filled with so much flowery language that it's really hard to decipher exactly what is happening or what's being said. Now, of course, some people can read it and pass the exam. Kudos to them. I'm not one of them. So, and from what I've noticed, the majority of us are also not like that. So, that's a rare breed of people. We need to capture them and put them, somewhere where we can study them because they are unicorns. JK. So, the first phase is the initiating phase. And the initiating phase is where your business value is being analyzed and researched. It is also the time where you're going to have sign off or rejection of your project charter. So, even though initiating sounds like we're initiating the project, we're kind of not really until we get to the end where we do the project charter, where we sign off on it. Why? Because when you're doing business value analysis, you're trying to understand, again, what are you getting out of this project at the end of the day? But that also means in order to fulfill that, you're writing a business case, which is the justification of the business value, and the benefits management plan, which is saying how we are going to achieve the benefits of this business value. And so then once you've discovered that and documented that in those two documents, then those two documents feed into the project charter. Now, of course, some people will be like, well, the project charter is just more than that. But at the end of the day, it's saying, why are we doing this project? Even if you include objectives that are very high level, you may have some high level planning, not crazily, but just some, where it might be more along the lines of we know these are the milestones we're going through, but we're just not sure what the requirements are or what the entry and exit criteria is or when that's going to happen. But of course, if you get sign off on your project charter, and actually before I continue on, so to make it clear in the real world what a project charter really looks like, think of requests for proposals, RFPs, which is actually talked about in procurement management, right? RFPs in the real world are our project charters, although less involved in the business value analysis and more involved into proposing how they would solve the solution based on historic information a little bit, not really necessary collecting a lot of scope. So keep that noggin, keep it in there, not noggin of yours. Then we move on into the planning phase. Now, the planning phase is where you've got sign off on the project charter. Now you're moving into the detailing of either your processes and your project, or your processes and some details of your project, and then leaving high level information floating in the ether for a little bit. Because again, you have to understand your processes, no matter whether you're traditional, which I hate calling project management traditional, but you can say maybe plan driven or agile or both. You need to know your processes. You need to know your roadmap of how you're going to do things from beginning to end. Which then, of course, once you've planned everything out or planned out at least your processes and planned out the details of, just a little bit of time of what you can understand right now, You then move into the kickoff phase, which is where you sit with the client, which of course that's after they've approved your project charter, and you sit with them and walk through the project charter to ensure that there is full understanding of what is going to happen from beginning to end of the project, which then leads into executing, monitoring, and controlling. Now, if you notice, I'm mentioning them both at the same time. Why? Always keep this in mind. Executing, monitoring, controlling. They're like paternal twins. They happen at the same time, but they do different things. In the PMBOK, we talk about work performance data, work performance information, and reports. So here in the executing phase, this is where you're just doing the work. And that's exactly what you're doing. You're doing the work, which is producing work performance data. So then at the same time, you're taking the data that's being produced over here, you're bringing it over into monitoring controlling, where it turns into work performance information through analysis, so that then you can put that analysis into a report, which then helps you decide whether you need to make a change or not. And this is essential because, again, integrated change control is very important when it comes to controlling and managing changes to your project. And so by looking at the work performance information put into a report that's derived from the work performance data, you are better able to determine if you're already, ahead of schedule, behind schedule, over budget, under budget, whatever the case may be. It also gives you the opportunity to utilize earned value type equations to understand variances and performance indexes. Are you close to your ETC? What's your ETCs look like? What do your VAC look like? What does the BAC versus the EAC? And understand if you need to, again, make a change or not. I will constantly say that until I'm blue in the face, but that's the point. So you will go through a constant iteration of this all the time. In Agile, with particularly Scrum, you have a planning, then you execute, monitor, and control, and then you go back into plan again, and then you go into closing, which you close out the sprint. You don't close out the project, you just close out the sprint. And then you go back to planning to plan out the next sprint, and then back into executing, monitoring, controlling. Once you've done the demo, you then go into closing, which is the sprint retrospective, rinse and repeat. In project management, when you're not doing Agile, you may go back to planning. It just depends, right? So if we want to think about plan-driven type environments, think about supply chains. Those guys need to really understand the nit and grit of every little thing they're doing, down to materials, how much, resources, machine availability, how many widgets are we going to produce, when are we going to produce it, how long are we going to take to produce it. They need to know all of that information. And so what they do is they get all that done in this planning phase, and then they go into executing, monitoring, controlling, and they may revisit planning if necessary. Now, when you do progressive elaboration, which of course Agile FMAs like to pretend that project management never has done progressive elaboration, which is not true. We know from previous projects that I've talked about in this stream. You you do the initial planning, right? So like we were talking about, you plan all your processes first, right? You plan out maybe a little tiny bit of your stuff, not necessarily 2 weeks, but you plan out a little bit. And then you execute, monitor, control. And then when it's time to detail plan out more, you go back to planning. And you do that. Then you go back into execute, monitoring, and controlling. And then when you get to the next point, rinse and repeat. Rinse and repeat until you have completed the product, service, or result. And then you can go into closing, where you get final acceptance from the client, which now we lead into the closing phase. Now, of course, a lot of PMs tend to struggle with the closing phase because most times we're really not necessarily around for a closing phase of a project. If you have, kudos to you. Um, but generally we don't, because, things kind of change or shift, or, whatever the case may be. So closing is where Okay, yeah, we may have been validating the scope along the way through, various types of testing, or if we did agile through demos and so forth. But you got to still get final sign off. Okay, so that can mean like the whole time you've been kind of demoing that your client liked everything, but then at the end they're like, nah, I didn't like it. And that's okay. But you get formal sign off that you still fulfilled the scope, even if your client didn't like it. It also means that at that point you are archiving all your previous data. So that can include architecture documents, testing documents, your lessons learned, which you're finalizing. If you've been a good PM, by the way, even if you're not agile, you have been documenting your lessons learned all throughout the project and not waiting till the very bitter end to document all your lessons learned. Now, of course, again, some people are just like, oh, well, in project management, people just, don't do that. And in Agile, we do. Well, in Agile, yeah, but, you know, project management still did it anyways. I mean, we have previous projects that we look at on this stream, for example. But at the end of the day, closing is essential. Any questions on the phases of a project? I'm going to refresh the chat really quick. Okay. All right. So no questions. So we're going to move on. So now we're going to start talking all the processes. Now, for all the processes moving forward after integration, of course, we're going to have this same little chart where we show you the process, the management process, and when it's done during what phase of a project. So, if you've noticed, this is integration management. This chapter is extremely essential for all of the rest of the other chapters. Why? Because of the fact that this describes how you as a project manager are the integrator to all the other processes to work together as a cohesive whole. I always like to describe project management as an engine in a car, right? The engine has all these different, you know, um, wheels and turns and all this stuff, right? And then there's the belt that loops around all the different gears and makes it all work together to make an engine that makes your car go forward, right? Same thing with project management. Integration management is that conveyor belt that brings all the other processes that are the different gears together to work as a cohesive whole. Now, as you see, the three items that are already highlighted in bold is the project charter, project management plan, and integrated change control. We've talked about this till I was blue in the face for the past now 28 minutes. So those items we know are in initiating and planning and monitoring, controlling. But we haven't talked about the other processes. So the next one is direct and manage project work, which is in the executing phase. Well, it's kind of obvious in the name of it itself. Although it may not be obvious to most people or to some people or whatever, it's, at the end of the day, it's basically that's what you're doing. You're directing and managing the project work. Your your project management plan is your talk. Direct and manage project work is walking your talk. So you're just doing the work. Managing project knowledge, which is also in executing, is where you start your lessons learned. And the PMBOK talks about that, where you manage the project knowledge by documenting it through lessons learned in various categories that incorporates both explicit and tacit knowledge. Very important. Then the next piece is the monitor and control project work, which is monitoring and controlling phase, which, again, this is where you're looking at work performance data coming out of the executing phase and analyzing to turn it into work performance information that then feeds into a report that then helps you determine whether you need to make a change or not, which that leads into integrated change control. And then, of course, the final phase is the final process in integration management is the close project or phase, which is in the closing, which that's kind of obvious in itself. So then we move on to scope management. Now, you're going to see scope, cost, schedule, and risk management are heavily done in the planning phase. Why? The reason being is because these processes require a lot of planning to prevent issues in the future, especially when it comes to scope, cost, and schedule and risk management. Now, of course, the PM triangle, of course, is scope, cost, and schedule, and they're essential because if you forget to completely check all your requirements have been documented and you miss one and you're later on performing the work or working on your project and then you realize, uh-oh, we forgot this thing. You have then completely and utterly thrown off your schedule and your budget and just forget the rest about the other processes because those are already impacted anyways. So the scope management process first starts off with the plan scope management, which is where you make the scope management plan. That is part of your project management plan because, again, the project management plan is your roadmap of how you're going to do all your project processes from beginning to end. So, scope management or plan scope management is where you make that document that's then put into the project management plan and how you're going to plan, identify, manage, monitor and control scope. Now, of course, in the scope management chapter, we really don't talk about scope creep and gold plating that much, but we do talk about that a lot when it comes into quality management. So then the next piece you're going to do, once you've done the planning of your scope management plan, you're then going to collect requirements. This one is really essential, okay? Because this is where you're doing the research and due diligence of identifying every piece of scope possible. Now, I know this is where agile people get all like freaked out, like, oh my gosh, you want me to identify all my scope right now? It's like, well, don't you want to know what you're doing? Now, of course, how agile approaches it is more at a epic level. So instead of detailed requirements, they tend to have epics where, one epic as an example could be a Coke can. And then your features can then be broken down into like building out the can, making the soda itself, printing on the can, sealing it, boxing it, all that. That becomes your features. In collect requirements for project management, you are trying to understand all your scope from beginning to end. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're doing progressive elaboration, you're going to identify all your scope right away. That's not true. When you do progressive elaboration, you're just doing little tiny chunks. Well, you're doing what you know right now. But that just means that when you go back into the planning phase to plan out the next little chunk of time, you have to collect the requirements again and progressively elaborate. Once you've collected all your requirements, you then define the scope. Now, this is where you are determining what is really in scope for your project versus what is not in scope. And you're going to see this too with risk management, where we just do a bunch of risk identification, but then we refine that list of risks. You're doing the same thing for your scope. You are collecting all these different types of scope, all these different requirements, etc., etc. And then you're kind of refining that to say, okay, what is really in scope for this project and fulfills the business value versus what's just like not at all. Once you've completed that, then you can create your work breakdown structure, your WBS. And this is where you decompose your scope down to the lowest level, which we call the work package. And then what that does is it creates a work package that is specific, definable, and can have specificity in association with cost, schedule, and resources. And again, that's essential because when you're building out the schedule, you need to know how long it's going to take you to do these activities and fulfill this work package. And when you do costs, you need to understand how much it's going to cost you to fulfill this work package and your resources because you need to know who's going to do the work. So that's why you need very specific and definable. Hence why I always make a comparison of the work package in a work breakdown structure to a feature because, again, it's very specific and definable. And they have to be. If you have something vague, you haven't decomposed low enough. Now, of course, industry standards generally require you to go about the fourth level, Which, okay, yeah, that's fine. But again, that's maybe not the lowest level for some programs or projects, right? Because at the end of the day, you need to make sure that it's tailorable. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on once we kind of finish. Or did I put that in here? I may have, I just don't remember. Anyhow, so I'm going to just say this, and if it shows up, I'll repeat it again. But basically, project management processes are very tailorable. Why are they tailorable? Because it allows you and your project team to work efficiently and to what would be of best interest in for the project to fulfill the business value. So, comparing a $100,000 project to a $100 billion project, you might not do very extensive risk management in a $100,000 project. You'll still do it, but maybe just not to the degree unlike a $100 billion project. So then once you've finished the planning phase, you then go into for scope management, monitoring, controlling, because I mean it's kind of obvious you're in executing, you're doing the work. So no need to really put something in there for that. But in monitoring and controlling, you're doing two things. You're validating the scope and you're controlling the scope. So when we validate the scope, we're saying, are we walking our talk? Which is therefore comparing our actuals to our baseline. And then controlling scope is that we're making sure we have the right scope, but we're also making sure that there's not being any add-ons to the scope. And this is where you probably have heard, if in the profession, something called scope creep, which scope creep can be very damaging and it can get out of hand very quickly. As I always like to say, don't do extra work without getting paid. Don't allow your customers to just add stuff on without giving you extra money to actually address it. But also, don't allow them to just pressure you to do it just because you also need to understand the impacts anyways and determine if you need to make adjustments to the scope to incorporate it. But now I'm going to say something that's maybe a little controversial and may get some project management coaches or whatever to get all up in a tizzy over it. But it's okay to say no to your client. I know, so shocking. It's okay to say no because not every harebrained idea is really in their best interest, particularly when it comes to the project's business value. And you, as the project manager, need to be able to say, that's not in scope. That's not even going to fulfill business value. That's not cutting the cheese. Okay? No. Now, you don't need to be mean about it. I mean, unless you plan to be, but then that's your prerogative if you want to be that PM. But you just need to be able to say no, or be able to say, you know what, that doesn't seem like that fits this project, but that looks like that could be another project. Which then, if you want to be a little sort of salesy, then you can kind of convince your client to move in that direction. Now, before I continue on, does anyone have any questions about integration management or scope management? Okay, moving on. Where does my mouse go? There we go. So now we move on into schedule management. And again, as you see, very heavy in the planning phase. Because again, you have to really schedule out all your activities to understand how you're going to fulfill the scope. And give me 1 second. All right, I am back. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, in the schedule management, we are in the heavily in the planning phase, and then we have one process in monitoring and controlling. So of course, again, like scope management, you're also going to make a schedule management plan that goes into the project management plan. And this is important because again, this is telling us how you're going to manage and run your schedule and monitor and control it so that you are meeting the activities necessary to fulfill the scope and the project and the requirements of your client. Now, of course, again, we after we have a work breakdown structure, right? So if we recall, in our WBS, we have work packages. That is your lowest level detail where it's very specific and definable and has, and can be associated with schedule, cost, and resources. So, under that work package, you're then going to define your activities. And that's basically saying, how am I going to do the work to fulfill this work package from, however long of a time frame is required. So, first, of course, you got to define the activities. So, you're not estimating any duration yet. You're just defining what are the steps to fulfill the work package. Then your next piece is to sequence these activities. So that's where we talk about the relationships, like the finish to finish, the start to start, the finish to start, finish to finish, all of that. You're basically trying to understand what is the sequence of these activities so that you can then determine critical path when you get to estimate activity duration and developing the schedule. So, of course, when you sequence them, you then are able to estimate those activities. Now, the schedule management chapter is the only chapter that heavily describes the different estimation techniques. So, you got 1 point estimating, analogous estimating, or also known as top down estimating, parametric estimating, heuristic estimating, bottoms up estimating, and 3 point estimating. So, that's a lot of estimation techniques. Now, from a professional experience, the best one, in my opinion, is the 3 point estimating. Why? Because with 3 point estimating, you then can utilize a schedule simulation tool called Monte Carlo. And what Monte Carlo does is it just simulates your schedule with all your sequencing, your durations, all that fun jazz, resources, risk, you name it, simulates your schedule hundreds of thousands of times to determine the probability of success or failure. And that's why I think that's the more reasonable one. Now, some people like to do bottoms up, which is where you go from the lowest level detail up to the highest level. That one, of course, as described, is a lot more accurate, but it's a lot more time consuming. Unlike its counterpart, the top down estimating, or also known as analogous estimating, that one is where you're going from the top, the highest level detail, down to the bottom. That one's not quite as accurate and it's not as time consuming. So keep that in mind. The 1 point estimating and 1 point estimating is just looking at every line and saying, okay, like I think it's this, then move on. No real thought process or anything of that nature. Heuristics is going off a golden rule of thumb, which I'm sorry, but like almost 100% of the time, there's no golden rule because people like to do things the way they like to do things. It's just the nature of the beast. And then, of course, parametric estimating, which I've never seen done before, but that would be really cool. It'd be like one of those, that beautiful mind moment where you see this really fancy equation that takes historic data and past project data and creates a mathematical equation to help you determine and estimate duration. Really cool, actually, in concept. I've never seen it done. I would love if someone has, but whatever. So then, of course, once you've estimated activity duration, you develop the schedule. This is where you do critical path analysis. You may do alternatives analysis. And what I mean by alternatives is maybe your client's not very happy with the date or whatever. So you try and figure out, through crashing methods, to understand how you can pull that in to meet whatever date your client wants if there's a date constraint. And then once you're done with the planning phase, like all the other processes, you go into for schedule management, monitoring, controlling, which is basically you are controlling the schedule. So you're watching it, you're basically comparing your talk, which is the baseline, to your walk, which is what you're actually doing. And the same thing you're going to see with cost. You're going to see this with pretty much all the other processes. Then you see cost management, which again, heavy in the planning phase, one process in monitoring and controlling. So again, you got a plan cost management, which is the end result is the cost management plan or the budget plan or whatever, which is you're saying, how am I going to plan, execute, monitor, and control my costs? Once you've done that, you estimate costs. So you should already have established your work breakdown structure, your activities with all its durations, and now you're taking the money to determine how much it's going to cost to fulfill these work packages based on duration, resources, and of course the activities required to fulfill it. And that's where the estimating techniques that I just talked about in schedule management also have to be done in cost management as well. So if you do it, 3-point estimating for schedule, you got to do 3-point estimating for cost. If you're going to do analogous estimating for schedule, you got to do it for cost. No ifs, ands, or buts. And it's the same thing for resources as well. You got to do the same estimating techniques. And then, of course, once you've estimated your costs, you determine the budget. This is where, again, you analyze your budget. You may do some alternative analysis to understand how to get the cost down if the client's like, oh, it's too expensive, and, figure that out. And then also you finalize that budget, which then again gets you out of the planning phase, and then you go into monitoring and controlling costs, which is essentially you're just watching to see, again, you're comparing your talk, your baseline, to your walk. This is also when you use earned value management analysis, or earned value analysis is what they really call it, but earned value management. And in the PMBOK and in a lot of PMP practice prep books, they list out all the earned value equations so that you know how to calculate that. So you're identifying basically schedule and cost variances and schedule and cost performance indexes, all that fun jazz to be able to say, am I walking my talk? And if I'm not, do I need to make a change? Pretty nifty, huh? Any questions on schedule or cost management? Okay. So then we move into quality management. So as you see with quality management, and you're going to probably see this too with communications management and stakeholder management, there's not a lot of processes. Now, that doesn't mean though you don't plan your quality management or anything of that nature. Even though you saw that scope, cost, schedule, and when we get to risks are very heavy in the planning phase, you still have to plan your quality management to a very good degree. Again, tailor to the needs of your project, but you still need to plan your quality management. So this is where you create the quality management plan, which again goes into the project management plan because it is the overarching roadmap of how you're going to do things from beginning to end. You will include various techniques that you would implement in terms of quality, whether that's benchmarking, histograms, whatever the case may be. Whatever you choose, you are basically going to implement that in your project. So again, once you get out of the planning phase, then you're executing, monitoring, controlling. Now I'm going to emphasize this because we haven't seen both of these together yet, except for integration management. Executing, monitoring, controlling. Like paternal twins, they both happen at the same time, but they do different things. So managed quality is where you are managing the actual processes of your quality management plan, creating that work performance data. Control quality is where you are controlling the quality of the product, service, or result you produce. The work performance information turned into a report helps you determine whether you need to make a change or not. And that goes the same thing for quality. So as you're executing and you're managing the quality and you see that the process is maybe not as efficient, right? You're going to see that when it becomes work performance information that's analyzed and then turned into a report, and it gives you the opportunity to justify a change. Very quick and easy and very to the point. Then we get to resource management. Now, of course, when we think of resources, it varies from industry to industry. Some people go, oh, well, resource management to me is not only people, it's also machines, it's this, it's that. It's basically anything you need to fulfill the project. That is resource management. That can include machines, materials, people, you name it. So, like all the other processes, again, you create a resource management plan that goes into your project management plan. Again, the overall roadmap of how you're going to do things from beginning to end, which is telling you how you're going to plan, identify, hire, execute, assign, not execute as in, execute is in implementing the resources to specific activities, assigning them to specific activities, and then when you plan to release those resources. Because again, you can't keep resources on for all the life of a project. Some key personnel, yes, but not everyone. And then, of course, if you've already done all the stuff for your scope, your schedule, and your cost, you're then going to estimate activity resources. So this is where you're going to add resources to your schedule with the budget so that you understand the effort. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you're not going to make changes and adjustments as you do it to the cost and the schedule too, but it is something that you have to keep in mind. Now, again, like schedule and cost, they both have to be done with the same estimation. Resources also has to be done with the same estimation. And so, of course, when you're done with the planning phase, in executing is where you acquire resources. Now, you're probably sitting there going, what? Wait, well, why wouldn't you acquire resources in planning? Well, you don't know who you need. How are you going to know who you need or what you need if you haven't planned it out yet? So that's why in executing, monitoring, controlling, that's when you acquire the resources. And then, of course, you develop teams and you manage teams. Now, in developed teams, you have, the ability to, in the real world, they talk about cross training. So you get people that, are kind of siloed in their skills, and then they go and they cross train with like a different area so that they become efficient. So you're avoiding like bottlenecks basically. So, if Billy Bob Joe, who's like your senior SME, goes out because they went on vacation or they got sick, you would hope that there's enough cross training going on that someone could kind of step up to the plate and handle at least what's going on until they return. Or even take over their role if they decide to retire, go to a different company, whatever the case may be. This is where also Tuckman's model comes into play. Now, the Tuckman's model is heavily used in Agile. Why? Because it's great in showing how you gain velocity in completing the work. The only difference, though, with the Tuckman's model in Agile is that they don't keep the adjourning phase. So if you remember, Tuckman's is forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning. Agile only keeps the first four and removes adjourning. Why? Because they believe in the fact that you're always continuously working. There's always continuous work. So therefore, there's no reason to adjourn because your team's now performing in a way that they work as a cohesive whole. They're able to produce a certain amount of velocity in their work. So therefore, why would you want to break them all up and have to redo that all over again? Although that then defeats the purpose of the definition of a project, which is a temporary endeavor with a defined beginning and end, creating a product, service, or result. Go figure. And then you're also managing teams, which is also when you do some conflict resolution. And I should have just included the YouTube video of The Office with Michael Scott. And if you're not an Office fan, I get it. But in The Office, Michael Scott, in one episode, finds out that, all the people in the office kind of have some conflicts with each other. So he starts doing conflict resolution very poorly, of course, and hilarious, but in real world, we'd never tolerate that. And trying to make win-win solutions instead of compromising and all that stuff, which is a great example of managing teams in a comical way, but in managing teams. And that's exactly what you would do. Now, in Agile, because managing teams also talks about different types of leadership styles. Agile heavily focuses on servant leadership, which servant leadership is really hard for a lot of people. Why? Because people tend to think that they need to have some control over what's going on, which is true. You kind of do. But what servant leadership says is to allow people to be autonomous and to make decisions themselves without you interfering all the time and or having to make the decisions for them, especially if there's SMEs, right? So, not that there's anything wrong with it. However, that can really go sideways, and a lot of the times, a lot of people struggle with it, especially when they prepare for the PMP exam. And then, of course, executing, monitoring, controlling, like paternal twins, happening at the same time, doing different things. So, in control resources, you are monitoring resources and how they're doing, how they're performing. Are they getting work done, right? Taking the work performance data, turning it into information, turning it into then a report to then determine if you need to make a change or not. And sometimes that change may be we need more resources because there's actually a lot more work than we thought. We're behind on schedule, so it'd be better to hire on more resources to get the work done, which that does become a fine line, and it's very easy to cross because if you hire too many resources, you may end up having resources end up stepping on each other or getting in each other's way, whatever the case may be. So it's one of those techniques that requires a little more scientific art in really determining how many more resources and to avoid having over duplication of work and so forth. Then, of course, we have communications management, which, again, like quality, it's only one process in each phase. And this is pretty straightforward, okay? So, communications management, you in the planning phase, you create the communications management plan, which goes into the project management plan, which is your overarching roadmap of how you're doing things from beginning to end. See how I'm repeating this over and over again because this will really help you in keeping this information in your mind and help solidify these concepts a little bit, even though it's like a brief description and discussion of it. So, in the regards of planning the communications management plan, you're just basically saying how you're going to establish, manage, monitor, and control communications, which is very important when we get to stakeholder management. And so once you've planned that out, then basically all you do is manage and monitor communications. So you make sure that you're communicating the right information to the right people at the right time is basically really important when it comes to communications management plan because some people may not want certain information at certain times or they want to receive the information in a certain way. It just depends on who your client is, right? And then you're monitoring the communications to see who's responsive, who's not, that sort of thing. Because in stakeholder management, that plays a huge role when it comes to if you got a stakeholder that started losing interest in your project. Now, before we start risk management, does anyone have any questions about what we just covered in terms of resource management and communications management? Okay. So now we're at risk management, and just like not executing, but for scope, cost, and schedule, you have a lot of heavy planning. Why? Because risks, so even though we have the PM triangle, risks, if not planned out appropriately, can sneak up on you and really throw your project off. And if we think about some heavy risks that have occurred that's had severe impact, like the target data breach, for example, even Edward Snowden when he, revealed certain information, although I'm not going to get into this conspiracy theories about that, but that's a risk. And a lot of people tend to not think about or try and foresee risks or think about risks that could potentially happen. So, in the planning phase, you first again create a risk management plan, which is how you identify, plan for, execute, monitor, and control risks and risk responses. Again, it goes into your project management plan, which is your overarching roadmap of how you're going to do things from beginning to end. Once you've established that, your next piece is to identify risks. So, just like scope, where you collect requirements, you have to identify every single potential risk because then you're going to get into the perform qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. Qualitative risk analysis is subjective analysis, and quantitative risk analysis is objective analysis. So why do I say that? So the qualitative risk analysis is subjective because it's based on your perception. It's based on people's perception of a risk. So what happens is that they may say, well, that risk looks like it's a low, whereas other people say it's a medium, so then you kind of have to come to a compromise, right? Whereas quantitative risk analysis is then taking data, actual data, to back whether that risk is really a real risk or not. And then, of course, that helps in refining your risk register so that you actually have risks that you should really be monitoring and not just looking at every single stupid little risk, right? Because there's just some low level risks that just aren't really necessary. But that's, of course, where you take different types of responses, whether to mitigate, avoid, or transfer. Low level risks, like ones that really don't have true impact on you, you can tend to transfer them or just accept them. It just depends. And then, of course, when you refine your risk register, you then plan your risk responses. What do we mean by that? So now you refine your risk. Now you need to know if and when this risk were to happen, what am I going to do? And this is where I was talking about the mitigating, avoiding, accepting, etc. So, and as part of that, you then need to say, to mitigate this risk, I need to do XYZ. So that is something that you have to take into consideration. So, like, for example, riding a motorcycle. You have a high risk of potentially getting into an accident. It's not about an accident. It's not about when, if, it's about when, right? So, in your risk response planning, you may say, if I get into an accident, these are the following steps I'm going to take. Same thing for anything in project management. If X risks were to occur, these are my steps to address it. Even if it's acceptance, you still have to have a response. And then, of course, again, once you're done with the planning phase and you've planned everything out, you then implement risk responses. And the only time you do that is if if an identified risk were to occur. That's when you implement the risk. If it hasn't occurred, you don't need to implement the risk. But monitor risks is where you continuously evaluate if this is still a risk or not. And by the way, some risk will actually become less risky as you continue to do the work of your project. Why? Because some risks are based upon you getting certain things done within your project so that it's mitigated, not eliminated. Don't get that wrong. Not eliminated, but mitigated. So that you're no longer threatened by that potential risk occurring. And then you can evaluate and say, well, where else could we implement, what else can we do with some of these contingency reserves or whatever. Then we also have procurement management, which again is a very short process too, just like communications and quality management. So of course, again, you plan procurement management, which means you are planning out how you're going to request, implement, monitor and control, and close out your procurement management. Now, it's not in the closing phase, but during monitoring and controlling, when you're controlling procurements, you need to determine if something's been fulfilled or not and determine if you can close the procurement contract or not. But then, of course, once you're done with planning, because that procurement management plan goes into the project management plan, which is your overarching roadmap of how you're going to do things from beginning to end. Then you conduct procurements, which is basically that. You send out requests for either proposals, information, or quotation. So request for proposal is where you're proposing a solution. Request information is where you just want to know something or ask questions about something. Request for quotation is pretty much like getting an estimate on how much it's going to cost, basically. And you conduct that, and then you control procurements. which is where once you've kind of established a contract with a third-party vendor, you just monitor and control what's going on, see if they're fulfilling their end, and if they're not, get rid of them. If so, continue on with the contract until they're no longer needed, kind of deal. Any questions before we hit the final slide? Okay. And now we come to the final slide of stakeholder management. Now, in stakeholder management, this is the only other process group that touches the initiating phase. So integration management touches initiating, and of course, all the other phases. But stakeholder management also touches the initiating phase. Why? Because during the process of identifying business value, you are also identifying your stakeholders. Why? It's essential to understand who are your stakeholders. Now, before I continue on, in the PMBOK, stakeholder has two different definitions. Well, not necessarily different, but it has two definitions depending on context. The first definition of stakeholder is the overarching, over-encompassing definition, which means it's not just your client that is a stakeholder. You as a project manager is a stakeholder, your team's a stakeholder, Billy Bob Joe down the street is a stakeholder, maybe the local government's a stakeholder. It's everyone. That is everyone and anyone who is impacted by the project, whether it's negatively or positively. The other definition is actually about your client, which is what stakeholder management is really about. Stakeholder management is not about everyone. It's about your client, the one that is the quote unquote buyer of the project. And when you're in the initiating process, you need to identify these key stakeholders because they have effects on your project. And if you don't do your due diligence in identifying all your necessary stakeholders, one stakeholder that you did not identify comes along and they throw in scope, that's going to completely derail your project. So that's why you got to do your due diligence in that one. Then, of course, when you have the project charter signed off, of course, you can go into the planning phase where you plan stakeholder engagement. And it's basically how you plan to engage, manage, monitor, and control stakeholder engagement. And this is where communications management comes into play. Because then when you're out of planning and you're in executing, monitoring, controlling, because remember, paternal twins happening at the same time doing different things, you're managing the stakeholder engagement by ensuring that stakeholders are remaining engaged. You're also implementing how you can get stakeholders who are not initially interested to be interested, and those that want your project to fail to not want it to fail anymore. But when I talked about in communications management, where this is important because you need to make sure that stakeholders remain engaged, this is where monitoring stakeholder engagement comes. And if you start to see where there's a stakeholder that maybe used to be like gun ho, happy with the project, all of a sudden doesn't respond, not participating, it's an indication that they may no longer be interested. And what are you going to do? How are you going to mitigate that? Which also includes how you're communicating with them to ensure that they remain engaged, which every stakeholder is going to be different no matter how you approach it. And that concludes our brief summary of project management concepts. I will open the floor to any questions before I end the live. Okay. Well, thank you for joining this stream. It's much appreciated. Again, if you like the content, please feel free to like, subscribe, and follow on Twitter, Twitch, Patreon, TikTok, and YouTube. If you like the content and would like to support it, please feel free to donate via PayPal or subscribe on Patreon where you get more benefits. Thank you for joining, and I will see you in the next stream.